Hey everybody, welcome back to Web Inspect, the semi-daily show for creative developers. I am Timothy Miller, your host, and today is Minutiae Monday. We're talking about forms. Forms are without a doubt one of my least favorite things to style in CSS. There are just so many variables when you consider the inputs and the drop-downs and the checkboxes and the buttons and all those things. They're all so different and unique, but you want them to be styled consistently. You want the form to feel coherent. And it can be very difficult to make all of these very different form elements coherent, but it's very important because you want your forms to be friendly. You want people to look at these forms and not be scared away because your ultimate goal is for people to fill out your forms, right? But forms have always been a problem in the past. I remember I had a client a few years ago that I worked on a donation form for, and this was a donation form that raised millions of dollars every month. And due to the needs of the business, it was also a pretty complicated form. So I spent 3 weeks just building the form, and then we spent 2 more weeks QAing it, like running it through all of these tests and processes and making sure it stood up to everything. And it was a royal pain, and I didn't like doing it. We ended up with a great product, but the fact that it took over a month to do one form is still something I'm a little bit bitter about, to be honest. But guys, about a week ago, I was working on a new form, and it was kind of a rush job, and it was a gigantic form, and I was trying to get it done the fastest way I could, and I found a trick that allowed me to lay out this form exactly how I wanted it, style it exactly how I wanted it, and it took me maybe like 30 lines of CSS and maybe an hour or two to get this entire form done. And it was revolutionary for me. I've never had such an easy time with a form as I had with this form. And it's really due to one trick, one very easy thing, and that is what I'm going to talk about today in today's installment of Minutiae Monday. So I hope you're ready to save weeks of work. Let's jump into the code and I will show you what's up. So one thing about forms that makes them complicated, that makes them difficult, is oftentimes we want to lay them out in a grid with multiple columns because it makes it a little bit easier to digest. It shortens it up, makes people look at the form and feel like there's less to do. So, and 2 columns is difficult because the box model for different form elements is different. And so let me show you why this is a struggle and how we used to lay out forms. I've got some HTML here. I'm just going to paste in here. I've got just a few inputs, a couple drop downs, a button. This is a very simple form. In the real world, you probably wouldn't get away with something this simple. So let me first show you some of the drawbacks of the way we used to have to style these forms. So in our CSS, we're just going to set up some basic styling first. We're going to set a max width. Going to center this form, and then basically what I want is I want an input and I want the label on top of the input, and I want all of these forms to be like that. So I'm going to have to style the input element and select elements themselves and tell them to be 100%, and that gives me kind of that stacked look that I'm looking for, but it's pretty crowded, so I'm also going to add some padding. So guys, you can see we've already got this 1 column form. The button, I'm just going to center that button for now. So we've got a 1 column form. Now the problems start to accrue when we want to split these up and kind of grid these out a little bit. So the way we used to have to do this was through floats largely, and floats were not really designed for this, but we're going to give it a shot just so you can see some of the problems that come with styling forms with floats. So we've floated these elements left. I also want to do like a width 50% kind of thing, but width 50% doesn't work. As you can see, it doesn't give us that nice 2 column layout because there are other things involved. When you set a width on these divs, it doesn't just do 50%, it does 50% plus padding and margin and other things that get in the way. So one way we can help solve that is to use box sizing. So if we set box sizing to border box, this does solve a lot of our issues, but it's still kind of strange because you can see like these 2 select forms. You'd think this one should be over here, wouldn't you? And I think this is actually happening because these text boxes are actually slightly taller. So this text box here is coming down and pushing this one to the right. So that's one problem with floats. There are myriad problems with this technique, and you end up with lots of little like things being 1 pixel off or 2 pixels off, and it also doesn't give you much control over individual things. It's hard to like swap things around and to really customize forms, and it's also hard to create like a one-size-fits-all structure where you can just dump anything into the form and it works. So this is the way we used to have to do forms, and there are a host of problems that comes with this. Anyone who has tried to float layout forms knows some of my pain. It's just very hard to make a one-size-fits-all solution using floats like this. Floats were not designed for this, and it's just very hard to get them to work when you have a very complex form. So round 2, I'm going to show you how I'm building forms now, and I'm going to explain a little bit about why I think it's better and why I think it will save you lots of time in the future. So let's get rid of all this CSS, and we'll start out with just the test form container, and we will do display grid. That alone didn't do much. You can see over here, everything looks pretty much the way it was. And actually, I'm going to add back my max width and center things just to make it a little bit nicer. So display grid on its own doesn't do very much. As you can see, this form doesn't look like it's changed at all since I applied that. There's one more thing that you need to know to be able to style your forms effectively. The rest of grid, I mean, the more you know about grid, the more useful it will be. But if there's one thing that you need to know about grid, it's grid template columns. So that is the next thing we need to use here. So we do grid template columns. And this is a way of laying out columns for your grid, basically giving you that 50-50 split that we were working with before. There's also a new unit that grid uses called FR. It stands for a fraction. So 1 FR stands for 1 fraction of the whole. And then we do 1 FR, and this should effectively give us the 2 columns that we're looking for. So you can see we've got our 2 columns here. Now we need to add back that with 100% styling we were using before. And also you can see like the padding and margin problems. Grid doesn't completely solve that, so we will still need our box sizing border box, just like so. Now you can see everything fits inside of the columns perfectly. And another added benefit to doing it this way is we can add padding to these things. And it pads everything out really nicely, and it actually subtracts that padding from these columns. So that essentially acts as your gutter. I think there is actually a way that you can add a gutter to your grid. I haven't looked into that yet. That's probably something that would be really useful to know, but I don't know it yet. So if you guys know that, you should tell me that I'm dumb in the comments, and I'll make another video about that. But for now, you can simulate gutters using padding. So now we've got this button that's kind of in a weird spot. What we want this to do is we want this to be centered at the bottom like we had it before. And I'll demonstrate the next cool thing about grid, which is you can control how many columns something spans using the grid column syntax. So grid column, you give it 2 numbers separated by a slash, and it goes from the beginning of the first number to the end of the second number. So we do 1/3, and we've got the wrong class name here, add an S. Okay, so that dropped it down to the bottom. And then we want to text align center, and we've got our buttons centered. Now, one other thing, I'm going to add a utility class that essentially makes something go the full width of the form. And we're just going to use this same grid column attribute, and we're going to add that class, and we're going to call it full width. We've got this full width column, and here's where this is powerful, because you can just add that full width to something like this, and it makes it span the whole width. So this gives you very tight and consistent control over form elements, which is something that CSS has never really had before. To say that I'm excited about having this much control over a form is an understatement. If I wasn't sold on the merits of CSS Grid before, I definitely am now. This example alone shows me just how powerful CSS Grid is and how useful it's going to be in the future. So guys, 3 takeaways from this video. CSS Grid is an elegant solution to the problem of styling forms that many of us have dealt with for many years now. I haven't done enough with CSS Grid to know what else it's going to revolutionize, but form design, I am sold. Also, box sizing border box, if you've never used it, start using it. It is amazing. And to get started with CSS Grid, all you really need to know is this grid template columns, and for bonus points, grid column, which makes it a little bit more flexible. But that's a great starting point. There are plenty more tutorials and articles out there that will help you get into CSS Grid if you want to. But for now, this is a good place to get started. I'm going to pretty up this form a little bit, and then I will put the link in the description below for you to poke at and play with if you are so inclined. Hopefully you learned something here. If you like what we're doing here, give us a like and a subscription. And always remember, guys, web development is difficult. It's not an easy thing to do, and it takes a long time to learn this stuff, but you do have what it takes. Don't give up the ship, never stop learning, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye!